Our interview this afternoon is with George A. Damiano. George was born in Riverside, California in May of 1924. He served in the United States Army from 1943 until 1946, World War II era. His highest rank attained was Tech Sergeant. This interview is conducted at Burleson, Texas on Wednesday, January the 12th, 2011. My name is Dale Dexheimer. I'm not related to Mr. Damiano. Also in the room is Milton Gibson, who is our videographer. This interview is conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress and also Operation Remember for the city of Burleson. And with that short introduction, George, you can tell us about your time in the Army during World War II. You might start with a little bit of your family history in Riverside and how it was growing up before the war, etc. So it's your story as you want to tell it, sir.
We'll start with the family. There was 8 of us in the family, 4 boys and 4 girls. And my dad came from Sicily and this country in 1903. He returned in 1907 to get married. Returned to the United States in 1907 and went to California, where my mother followed him. And she got there in 1907 too. And he started his life in California. And eventually he wound up in a small town called Murrieta, California, which is just north of San Diego, about 25, 30 miles. And most of us were born in Riverside. You had to take either a horse and buggy or go down dirt roads to get to this major town. And eventually he returned to Los Angeles. It opened up a couple of big stores. And the Depression come, and he had to return to Paris, California, where I went to school. And most of my brothers and sisters went to school there. And during the time when the World War II started, I was asked to go in the Navy, but I promised my dad I would finish high school. And at that time, my sister's fiance was on the USS Arizona, and he wanted me to join the Navy, and I could have selected the Arizona, but I had promised my dad I would finish high school. And so Chuck is in there in Pearl Harbor right now. He's went down with the ship. Then eventually I finished high school, and there wasn't too many more weeks after the high school that I went in the Army. And the first place they sent me was to Fort MacArthur, California, where you receive all your uniforms. And then I was sent to Camp Roberts up in Northern California, just this side of San Francisco, and took all my basic trainings there. And I was very fortunate that I had to have 3 more weeks of training, or I would have been on the train heading for the Battle of the Bulge. And so I finished up my training, got my leave at home, and they sent me clean up to Fort Ord for another week or 2 training. Then from there I went up to Vancouver, Washington, where we waited for a shipload of troops to come in before we could get a tripload of troops to send over to the Pacific. Well, we went to Hawaiian Islands, where I took jungle training. And then from there we went to Iniwita Island. From Iniwita Island we got back on the ship and went to Saipan. And Saipan is where most of the fellows that I trained with, we split up because I had to have a minor surgery on my right eye. And, they went to the Philippines, and I couldn't go with them because I had to patch over my eyes. They said, you're not to leave here until you have your eye completely healed. And so I waited. They had replacements that were going to go to Okinawa, and it kept me back for another 10 days because of my eye being patched up. And so in the meantime, I would go down to the air base where the B-29s were flying in and out to bomb Japan, and kind of buddied around with a crew that was bombing Japan, coming back, and the name of the B-29 was a Sweater Out. Well, they just installed a new engine on the plane, and they asked me if I wanted to fly, go out and test where they're testing the plane, the engine, and so sure, I took a ride with them on a B-29. But it wasn't more than, well, it was that next day, and I was walking back down to the air base when a fellow pulled up beside me in a Jeep, and he says, did you know that the president died? That was President Roosevelt. So I thanked him, and I continued on down. That was on April the 12th, I believe, 1945. Well, I finally got on a ship and headed for Okinawa, and I landed there on May the 4th, I think it was, 4th or 5th. And so I was considered what we call a replacement. In the 7th Infantry Division of the 184th Regiment, and they asked, when I eventually got to that point, there was a group of us standing there, and there was a sergeant that came over, and he told Sergeant Shively to come over and pick another fellow out from Kansas, a big fellow, and both of us were over 6 foot tall. He said, you two fellows come with me. So I guess he needed somebody in a machine gun squad to carry the heavy cans of ammunition. So that's how I got into the machine gun squad. So we had quite a few guys. They had lost quite a few men, were wounded. Not too many were killed, but there were a lot wounded out of that squad. And then it wasn't but a couple of days after I was there, they selected me and another fellow to go to some special training for a sniper scope. It was the first ones that were designed, and we were going to special training for the sniper scope for night vision, which I got to use later on. So these fellows out of the regiment were returning from the front lines. They were up there for about 2 weeks on the combat. They lost half of their men, and so we went back up there and told us, well, we're leaving to go back up and fill in for replacements where we just left. So we got on the truck, and it was raining. Well, it started to rain in Okinawa. It rains at average of 1 to 1/2 inch, 2 inches a day. And it rained, and it was just, so we put our parkers on and got on the truck and went. And where they took us off, we were supposed to go through the town of Yanabaru at 1 a.m. in the morning. But they put us up on the side of a hill that was just taken by the 96th Division, just took this hill. And we went up there and parked ourselves on the side of the hill till 1 a.m. in the morning. And then we had orders to leave, so I was the last one in the squad, was walking down this mountain. It was a hill. And we were going into this town of Yanabaru. And the Japs didn't realize that we were moving at night. They never expected the American troops to do any fighting at night. So, being as I was the last one, I was always looking back behind me. And I had two cans of ammunition, plus all the material that were in spare barrels, a rifle. It was hard to follow with all that mud on you. And so the infantry, the riflemen already went through the town. We were just about halfway through. And they were parked on a hill on the other side. We would hear some firing once in a while. We'd hear some rifles go off, and I was scared. I guess everybody was. It's because it was awful dark. Every once in a while, the Navy would shoot a flare off. So eventually, we went through this town and went over this first little hill, and they set the machine gun up. The first gunner and second gunner set the machine gun up. And one of them was so muddy they couldn't use it, so they had to clean it out. But I had my back to the machine gun, sitting looking towards a hill that we just come over. And the Jap walked out of a cave there, and we didn't know there was a cave that small, you know. So he didn't realize Americans were over on the hill past him. And there was a couple of GIs up on the hill, and they just took one shot and they brought him down. And there wasn't much going on around the gun for a little bit, but as I was sitting with my back to the gun, I was looking to the area behind us where we had just come over the hill, and it was two Japanese soldiers that had to come out of a cave and was setting up a Jap machine gun. And there were three fellows sitting on the left of me, and the first shot hit right to my left. It missed all four of us. And we jumped into the shell crater that had a bomb crater there, was almost full of mud and water. And it happened to be those two guys that were up on the hills shot those two guys in the machine gun. So that's when we started to have a little action on this hill. Of the Capeless, I think his name was Capeless, C-A-P, Capeless. He was sitting behind a gun, and one of the rounds came over. A Jap shot him and hit him in the head. And the bullet spun around inside of his helmet liner and really ricocheted into his head, but didn't really do that much damage. Just you can tell it brought a lot of blood out. But they sent him back to the medics. I never seen him anymore. And a few minutes after that, I was sitting behind the gun. He's gone and on guard duty. And one of the fellows come running up the hill there. And the Jap was shooting at him with a machine gun, and he said, "They almost got me." And I says, "Wait a minute, I think they did." And he did. He was running so hard, he didn't realize he got hit. And he had blood coming out of his fatigue jacket. And I said, "Yeah, you got hit somewhere in the shoulder here." So right away, the medics, each one of our companies has a couple of medics with them, and they put him on, patch him up right away. And I didn't see Lewis until we left the island. He come with us on going to Korea. And then one of the guys in the mortar squad was behind us, and he come up there, and a round hit him under the arm here, and just flesh wound, and that hurt worse than what Lewis did. So we kind of settled it down, and that's a matter of speaking, you're only moving about maybe 100, 200 yards at a time. You know, you don't really move a lot faster than that. So we moved another couple hundred yards to the next hill, and it was getting dark, and we couldn't take that hill because there was too many Japs on it. And so we dug in, and Sergeant Shively told me, he says, "You don't have to put in guard duty tonight, George, because we have an odd man." I says, "Okay, that's well, I'll dig my hole deeper." So in the morning, well, I can hear the guys hollering all night because they got hit or wounded, because the Japs were throwing these satchel charges over the hill, down the hill. And what they'd have inside of these satchel charges tied onto them was like wire and nails and stuff like that, junk, so when it exploded, it would have more penetration of fragments going there. And I can hear those guys hollering. But eventually the riflemen took that hill in the morning. I don't know how many men they lost. I know there was 2 or 3 of them. And we went up on top of it, and I finally, told us to dig one of the machine guns over on the left flank over there. And the riflemen were down below us. We were up on the high ground, they were down below. And in front of us was a large escarpment. On that island, everything was in coral, it was just like concrete. They drop a bomb on the coral there, just like a firecracker, throwing it out on the asphalt. It just didn't do no damage. So this escarpment was, I'd say, a couple hundred feet high, maybe 1,500 feet long, and full of potholes and caves. Well, I was sitting up there behind the gun, real quiet, and it was sprinkling a little bit, not too hard. And all of a sudden, this field artillery piece would come out of this cave and start shooting down the canyons, down the valley. And they couldn't, by the time the guys that get their rifles and machine guns zeroing on, there was about maybe a couple hundred yards over to it. Well, he would pull that gun back in there. So they called in the Navy, they called in Navy Corsairs that would drop some bombs on them. But they couldn't hit it. That's a pretty big target for Navy. They would release the bombs over my head, actually, when they'd scoop up, but they never could get it. So I was sitting there nice and quiet, and finally one of the fellows in the squad, Peroy, he come up to relieve me. He hadn't got out of the hole and walked 10 feet. No, I had walked out of the hole and walked 10 feet, and a bullet hit him in the head. So I heard him holler medic, so I rushed back up there and got him out of the hole, hollered for the medic, come up to there, and he took the helmet off, and just like on Pressler, a capeless that spun around in the helmet, and it just really hit him pretty bad. His picture's right here. He's this young kid, but that's the last time I seen him. There was a lot of fellas like that would get wounded, and you wouldn't see him anymore. Cut it off. Get a drink. So we stayed there most of the day. And the next morning, that night we stayed there too. The next morning, Lieutenant Hammerly had a squad down in the bottom of the ravine down in there. And it was early in the morning, and we can hear shooting going on down there. We knew we had some infantry down in there because we couldn't quite see them. They were hid by rocks and debris and stuff. So here he comes back, sliding up the hill, walking back up the hill to us, and he said they got ambushed by Japs, and they had killed 3 men, and 3 of them were wounded. And I was just getting ready to have a cup of coffee, so I give him a cup of the canteen of hot coffee. And there's an article in the book I just counted out that he got a Silver Star for that. But anyway, we stayed there most of the day, and we couldn't cross that ravine to get that escarpment. It was too dangerous, so the CO decided we'd go around the roundabout way to come into the rear of it. Well, we made that pass to go around it. It took us about 2 days to get around it because it was a long ways. And we come up to another ridge that was all blasted with artillery shells, bombs. There was nothing left on this hill, but we pulled up there and started to dig in, and the lieutenant, Lieutenant Graff, he wanted the machine gun set up in a certain place, and he walked over there and he said, "No, they don't look like it's a very good place for a machine gun. There's no good field of fire." And so he said, "We'll just take the back trigger housing out of it, and we won't use it tonight. We'll just pull guard duty." And then he went back more than 15 minutes later. He come back and said, "We better put it up. We're going to set it up on on a little slope here, so that it was you had to get up, you had to dig some holes in it to get up there, and you had to hand a gun up to the guy. And eventually, Blackie got up there, and Hildemeyer, they got up there on that hill. And I remember I was sitting down there on a can of ammunition, and I watched Blackie lift his arm up, and he was pointing. And a machine gun hit him, Jap machine gun hit him and it took his right elbow out. And he fell right down in my lap. And I had my knife stuck in my combat boots, and I took it out, and I got some material from his fatigue jacket, and I put a tourniquet on his arm. And finally the medic got there. There was only just about 6 or 8 of us up there, because most of us were the machine gun squad. The mortar squad was still down and hadn't come up there. And that's and then Blackie, I remember the last thing Blackie said to me, he says, "Why the hell wasn't it my left arm? I'm right-handed, you know." That's the last thing he said. He was right-handed, and it hit him, took his right elbow out. So we stayed there all night. And that was one of the darkest and blackest nights I can ever remember. I couldn't even see my hand in front of me. Well, that's how cool. And raining. And the next morning, here comes a SEAL, and we were getting ready to open up some cans to have something to eat. And he said, "No, we haven't got time to eat. We're going to go up to the top of the ridge up there." So we picked up all this stuff, my guns and everything we could. It took off, and I was following. We had a squad of men, and I guess the mortar guys were behind us this time. And we were starting to go up this hill, and it made a big old right bend and went around, and I couldn't figure out, why the hell aren't we going up? Why are we going around? And I could look out there, and I seen this 16-inch dud off of a battleship sitting there in the mud, never went off. And somebody decided to walk around it, so they did. And we got to the top, and it was, because the sun was just trying to come out, it was foggy, a little foggy. And we were walking in kind of a haze fog, and we come to a clearing that we walked out into. There were 2 of us at this clearing. I don't know where the other men were. They were to the right or left, but I walked out there with these 2 cans of ammo, still have my carbine on my shoulder. And out in front of me, about 100 feet away, 2 Japs walked out of the fog there. And we were walking towards each other, and they just turned around and walked back in the fog like I did. We went back in the fog, and that's the last time I seen them. But we finally got up there. There wasn't any shots fired off, and we got up there. It was we were probably, say, 500 or 600 feet above the ocean. We were looking down on the Yellow Sea between Okinawa and China, the Yellow Sea. And the Navy would come up there in this little harbor with these rocket launchers like the LCI. And they would drive up there and they'd start launching all these rockets. And then they'd get through and they'd take off, and another one would come back in there and launch the rockets. They'd have a target. Well, we were sitting there watching, and all of a sudden this artillery started shooting at us. And my rounds were coming in, but he couldn't traverse because he had some obstacles like a cave, and he couldn't get the gun to go traverse over far enough to get us. He was only shoot forward. So we got by that, or we would probably get hit, most of us. And I was sitting there talking to one of the riflemen, and as we were looking down on the ocean, and he's looking ahead over there on the next hill we were going to take, and he says, "You see that Jap up there with white gloves on?" I said, "No, I don't have that kind of eyes, you know." He says, "There's a Jap up there." So he was from Arkansas, a rifleman from Arkansas, and he zeroed in on that guy, and he says, "I got him." The next morning we went and took that hill, and there was that Jap with the white gloves on up there. Well, during that night before we went up there, we dug in, set the guns up, and we were waiting for the telephone to be brought up to us. and a guy was going to bring us some wire with a spool, unwinding it. And you can see him coming. But somebody didn't get the word that he was bringing us a telephone wire, and somebody shot him. See? If you don't get the word or the password, you can be in trouble. But, one time I had to lift my arm up, a flare went off, and I lifted my arm up, and I had this wristwatch that had the fluorescent dials on it. And the guy about 10 yards away from me, another foxhole, he said, "George, take that watch off." And I guess it shined a little bit, and nobody ever did notice it, and I didn't either. So we went up that hill where the Jap had the wet gloves on and moved up there. As we were walking up there, I remember there was a fellow, a rifleman up on a slope up on the side of me. We were up on a little slope that reached out into the ocean, the cliffs. But on the other side was a little valley. So you had to be up on a ridge to see both sides. And this guy said, "Hey, I want you guys to come up here. I want you to see this." So we went up there, and there was a Jap. We're moving. They were retreating to the end of the island in columns of two, just retreating. And they had word that the Japs were pulling out, but they didn't know when or where. So I guess we had a forward artillery observer with us in our company, so they called him up, and he radioed back right away and called for artillery, and they start dropping those rounds in. You can see them hitting right in those Japs, just like sitting in a show watching something. So we moved on up to our area where we were going and pulled in there. And we had been there all morning where the sun was just trying to come out, and we were taking off all my shirt and trying to dry these clothes out. And finally, Tony, one of the cooks are the people that take care of not only the food stuff, but they take care of other beans that are back in the company CP. And so when you come to a company, you have a blanket that you roll up, and inside this blanket is dry underwear, dry socks and things. So Tony was one of the cooks, and he used to talk to me a lot. He knew he was a Portuguese kid. He says, "Can you use some dry socks, Jordan?" I said, "Well, hell yes, I haven't taken my shoes off for a week, So he brings me some socks and some cigarettes. He kind of liked me, And I used to always kid him. I said, "Hey, Tony, why don't you come up here and spend a night with me in the front lines?" He said, "The hell with you, I ain't going up there." So we stayed there, and I dried out a little bit. Got to know most of the guys in the mortar squad. And so during I think it was about May the 26th or the 27th, somewhere there, I had it written down. Vic Knighty was our first gunner. And so him and I pulled guard duty together. And and so I told him, "Tony, I'm going to go back in." We had taken two ponchos you put together, and you make a little tent out of it. You snap the buttons together. So I was sitting back in there, and I went back over to see if I can get some sleep, and I'm sitting on my helmet. And all of a sudden, all the fireworks start shooting off. And I had my weapon over there by the gun, the machine gun. I had to cross maybe 100 feet to get to it. And I could hear him, and Vic Knighty is hollering at me, "Get over here, get over here." And the Japs all out in front of us in the rocks, And I look out there, and I said, "Hell, I'm going to get shot just running over there." So I got down real low. And in the meantime, the mortar squad could see what's going on too. So they start dropping rounds into tubes. One of them went over where the Japs were, but the other one went straight up in there and come down right behind me, about 15 feet behind me, and blew the hell out of my tent, my little poncho tent. And I was way down, and I didn't have a helmet on. I'm sitting on it. But I was down so low, the mud and everything blew up above. What they did was they didn't dump the water out. because of the rain, it filled it up with water, and they dumped water out of the other one, but one of them, they must have some water still in it. So the round it went up and come down, it exploded right near me, and between me and the tube, the mortar tube, hit the guy loading it under the arm. A piece of shrapnel hit him under the arm. His name was Newman. He was from Los Angeles. And at just about that time, we had a heavy machine gun on the hill from the heavy weapons platoon. And he opened up on these Japs, and there must have been about 6 of them down there, and he wiped them all out. And I don't think they got more than 2 or 3 rounds on our men at all. So we checked them all out. I never did go out and look for souvenirs, or they'd always go out and look for stuff and bring me back stuff. So we stayed there another day or two, and I drive out. I'm trying to think when we went after that. Well, during the time I was there, we had to give some overhead firing protection for one of the weapons rifle platoons who was going to scout the hill in front of us. And it was this hairy little hill, man. It was just nothing but rocks and caves for Japs. So we went up there, we set the gun up on a little rise, and I remember I got a letter from my sister, and my oldest sister, and I just started opening it up, just started to read it, and I heard this firing and shooting going off out in front of me. And I can't remember who was on the gun with me. And wasn't more than 3 or 4 minutes later, these guys had come up that had passed through here to go to the squad had passed right behind us to go up there. What was left of the squad come back, and they said they've got 3 dead, 3 wounded. And I went up and helped them bring out the wounded. We couldn't bring out the dead then. So we stayed there all day, and it was just, we stayed in that area for 2 or 3 days, and then it was about that time E Company come up to relieve us. And we were sure glad to see them come up and relieve us. But the Japs had moved out of that area, and the E Company went right up and took that hill. So we followed E Company for a couple of days until we got down near the end of the island, because there's so much that I have missed telling you that doesn't really relate to killing or anything like that. I have jumped a lot of things that I thought maybe you wouldn't like to hear, but so we got an area down there. It's called Mabuna. And that's where these Japs all congregated when they went to the island. On our right flank was the 96th Division, the 77th Division, the 6th Marines, and the 1st Marines were on our right flank. So we had 5 divisions going across the island. And as the island got smaller, they pulled one out. So they pulled the 77th Division out, and the 96th Division was on our right, which they were always they always fought most of the 3 islands that the 7th Division were operated in. The 96th was there like a buddy division with them all the time. And so most of the fellows that I trained with in the state went in the 96th Division when they shipped them to the Philippines. And I was the only one out of that bunch in Fort Ord, Camp Roberts, that went to the 7th Division. So we were, trying to remember, we stayed in this other area that we went to, stayed behind this E Company. And we knew that something was coming up big because they brought the kitchen, the cooks brought the kitchen supplies up there. We was able to bring a weasel up and come through the mud with some hot food. And at the end of the chow line, they always had an orange or an apple. And we knew that something was up if we got an orange or an apple. That's happened before, you know. They don't give you nothing but food. If you get a piece of fruit or something. So we figured, well, that we're going to be moving out. It wasn't no sooner after we were thinking about it, an hour later, we were all putting our packs on. We were moving out that night. So we moved on out. And the Japs were awful thick down there. I think they estimated there was still almost 10,000 Japs down there at the end of the island down there. Most of them wanted to surrender. They didn't want to fight. There was a lot of diehards that would kill ourselves. And so we finally set up the CP down there, and we set the guns up behind a little small wall, which was about 3 feet high. A rock made out of rock on the wall. Some farmer had made it. And we were looking down in this valley where you could see Japanese running all over. But then beyond that was a lot of escarpments and coral, and then beyond that was the ocean. You could see the ocean if you look way out there, and that's as far as they could go. They're going to either go in the water or drown or surrender. So we parked there. During the night, you know, there would be a multitude of Japanese would want to come through your lines to go up north. Northern part of Okinawa was a beautiful pine trees and a lot of growth. This part we were on were nothing but coral and caves, not a tree, living tree around. So anyway, the first night we were there, we seen a lot of action. I see Japanese running in front of me, soldiers blowing themselves up with hand grenades in their stomach. And in the morning you go out there, you see bodies all over. And most of them didn't have any weapons. They just wanted to get out and go up north. And then about the second night, all hell tore loose. I was laying down in there behind a wall, and all of a sudden, everything starts shooting off, and I run up and grab my carbine, and I instead of pushing the safety off, I push the clip release. The clip fell out. And so I grabbed this Jap rifle that was on the wall. I knew it was good, and we had a round in it. So I'd start shooting it at the Japs. You could see the flares would go off, and you could see maybe 15 or 20 Japs out there running around like a bunch of Chinese at a fire drill. You know, they were just didn't know which way to go because the flares went off, and it surprised them. And we didn't really shoot the machine gun. Everybody was shooting rifles at that instant. The next morning they went out there, and there was even some Japanese nurses out there that were shot, wounded. And all they did, they went out. I never could go out there and check the bodies. They went out there and they just looked for souvenirs, but I didn't. So it went on like that for about two more nights. We stayed there about 3 or 4 nights. And then we were setting up the gun up on another area about 100 feet to the right. And it had a path that came up, and the gun was right in front of this path. And so I was pulling Gardu there with Pressler, and we were so tired, you know, you haven't slept, you don't sleep at all. In fact, what you do is you take your cigarette, you burn yourself. My hand was all burned up from sticking cigarettes in there, from waking up. And I look over and I see Pressler, yeah, he's awake, his eyes are open, he's looking straight ahead, you know. And so all of a sudden, I'm sitting there with this carbine in my, I'm pointing out that way. The Jap jumps up in front of me from here to the camera. And I just pulled the trigger. And I held the trigger down, and 15 rounds come out. And he comes to, and he says, what's going on? What's going on? Well, that's when I realized that he was sleeping with his eyes open. And that's a fact. People do that. And he was sleeping with his eyes open. I said, you were sleeping, weren't you? He says, I must have been sleeping. So I didn't want to pull duty with him anymore, but I did. But and so it wasn't about another night after that. I had this scope, and I had this scope, and I was those days. This first type of scopes they had was fed off of a battery, and you had a cable come up to the rifle in your scope. You look through it. It had a lens on it that big, so you look through it and you see the object. And I happened to be looking through it, and I seen a Jap walking up the trail towards me. He's like a ghost. And I got ready, and I pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. I didn't check it because I didn't know if a round was in there or not. So I pulled the hammer back and went back in, and it went click, and it wasn't real quiet, and he heard it. He jumped off the trail. So then we were still in that same area, but we didn't shoot the gun off that day. And that's when the planes, one of the planes flew over and dropped all these leaflets. That was the Japanese had surrendered. It was supposed to be on June the 21st. So up walks this two Japs. One of these was that Jap officer that I tell you about, and another private. And he come up to me and asked me about if he could have a drink of water. And I asked him, where did he learn to speak English? He said, I went to Hollywood High School. And Professor was wanting to shoot him. I said, no, don't shoot him, because they just sent us word. We got all these flyers here that they're take the Japanese who surrendered, take them back to CP before they could take him over to the interrogation. But he had just received a letter from his mother that morning that his brother had been killed in the Philippines in the infantry. So he had a reason, but I kept him from shooting that Jap. And we went on a little while, and after that, I took these Japs back there. A little while after that, they asked for anybody wanted to go with a squad of men down in the valley just for a little patrol. And I didn't go, but Preston says, I'll go. So all he had was his .45. It was wrapped up in some cellophane paper to keep the rain off of it. And I was sitting behind the gun. I can reach it and see him down there. He must have been about 100 yards down there in front of me, and I can see him. He was the last guy in this squad of about 10 miles. They were just going out there so far and look around, and they were going to come back. But he fell. He went down, and I couldn't figure out why he went down. The Jap was in the grass, was in the weeds down there, and threw a hand grenade at him. And a piece of it hit him in the shoulder. And he went down with his .45, and he's beating this Jap on the head. See? And he killed him, practically killed him. When the guys heard the grenade go off, well, they come back and killed the Jap. But then Professor brought me he come back, and he brought that .45 up to me. He had blood on it, and he only able to get one round off because it jammed. And he gives it to me, and he says, I'll see you later. He was going to the medics, and I never seen him anymore after that. So, and then another thing happened a little bit further over there with the Marines. We could see the Marines over there because the island was getting narrow. They might have been, say, like less than a quarter of a mile from us. And all of a sudden, somebody's shooting at us with their crossfire from their position across the valley, and they're hitting around our gun, our men. So we start shooting back over there until they stop. They didn't realize that, see, you have these markers you lay on the ground, kind of fluorescent markers, where the airplanes can see them, and you can tell you where the front lines are. Well, they were way ahead of the front lines. That's the way they fought. They would move ahead and take major objects, and little objects were still there, and the guys behind them would mop it up. So we stayed there for that evening, and then I guess it was the next morning they sent word down. I was sitting on the other gun, and they sent word down that there was a squad of men approaching, or going to come in front of us out of the 96th Division, and beware that their patrol is coming in front of us. Don't shoot. Well, the first guy that came squad leader to cross in front of the gun was Vernon Bangs, the guy that I was slept next to in basic training, you know. So I asked Vernon, I said, hey, Vernon, where's Goebel? Goebel was the guy who slept on the other side of me. He said Goebel got killed yesterday morning. He had one of these. The Army and military sent us up. We used to have these grenades that have 5-second fuses on them. Well, they made some that had 3-second fuses. And we didn't know it. And I guess Vernon got one hold of one, and by the time he dropped the handle went off, and he didn't have that other 2 seconds to throw it, it went off. And I could tell one night some of the fellows were throwing grenades. I said, those grenades sure go off in a hurry. You can sit there in the dark and you can hear them. And that's what they were. They were the new 3-second fuses, and they didn't tell us about them. I don't know how many other people might have got hit with them. So we had the same way with bouncing Bettys. We set out a lot of bouncing Bettys, which are trip flares with wires that are about 6 inches off the ground. And the only ones that actually hit them were the goats. We had a lot of goats in Okinawa. And you'd be all of a sudden, they'd trip these damn flares and they'd jump up in the air about 6 feet and explode. You see? I don't think I ever did hear one. Japs ever touched one. I never, but goats did. So one day when we were getting ready to set some out, I wasn't there, I was over somewhere else, but one of the fellows, the pin come out and the damn flare went up in the air and it almost killed him. Most of the time the pins go in there and they get a little worn, you're in and out every night, so they probably what happened wore out. So eventually we stayed there for almost 4 or 5 days. That's one spot. And then we had E Company was moved up on a little cave, a plateau place, or not, I don't know how to say it, but down below them was the ocean, and it was caves and coral. And they found out that right below that was where the Japanese general's headquarters was. We didn't know it. So they found out from the night before, because out of all the officers and the generals that committed suicide, Harry Carey, one of them was their cook, and he come out and told the GIs. About ready?
Go ahead, George. We'll
So
give you a sign.
He told the weapons infantrymen that the general's headquarters is underneath, and so that's when they started bringing all the big wigs up there. And I've got a picture of guys standing on E Company, standing on that hill before the military come up with all their cameras and everything. So they were the first ones there. So anyway, I think I covered a multitude of things. I probably skipped half of it, but I think I covered a lot of it.
Let me ask you a couple of things here, George, not to cut you off. Like most veterans that Milton and I talk to, most people don't toot their own horn.
I know it.
You received 2 Purple Hearts, right?
Yeah.
You haven't said a thing about it.
Yeah, I skipped some of that. Well, the first one was up behind this wall, and the Japs are shooting these artillery over there, and we don't know if it was Americans but they were both shooting. And I remember when I was looking over the wall, and Brian was on my left, and something hit me on the back, come down my back, boom. And I told Brian, quit horsing around, Brian. I thought he was, slapping me on the back, and he said, they didn't do nothing. And I looked down, there was a piece of metal about 2.5 inches wide, about 6 inches long. part of the shell that come down and hit me in the back. It just ripped my jacket open and skinned me and, you know, tore all the skin off and everything. It didn't really go in real deep. And it happened to be that the medic was standing behind me. He seen right away what it was, so that's what it was. He said, "You're not in bad job." And he put some Band-Aid stuff on it and stuff, but that was the first one. And then the one where I went down after we had mopped the island up. You mop the island up. You take a company of men. You go back up north. And you're picking up trash, empty cases and stuff. And as we dug in, they called us back out and says that we had to go back down there. Some Japs down on the end of the island down there don't want to surrender. So we were going back down there, and we weren't using a machine gun. And I was about the second or third guy, and these other guys had walked by this Japanese, and this guy, Japanese, stood up and threw a grenade at me. And I can see his hand coming up. He hit. You have to hit him, fuse him by hit a hard object with them, Japanese grenades. So as his hand come down, I ducked, and that's when it hit me all in them legs here. You know, I was all full of bullet holes, all these, just my legs, you know, and a lot of the dirt and fabric, coral rocks and things hit me on the helmet, hit me in the shoulder, you know. But my legs were exposed, so that was the second one.
Make a comment here, George. Milton and I have done a few of these interviews. I don't think we've talked to anybody that has the detail and remembers the things that you remember. You remember almost all the guys you served with.
Well, I'll tell you one thing.
Shively.
I only give you about 1/3 of what's actually happened.
Sergeant Shively.
Yeah.
How long were you with Sergeant Shively?
About 40 days, 30, 40 days.
You can still see him, can't you?
Yeah, but I look at his picture once in a while, you know, not all the time, but you got a camera on or?
It's on.
You see, this is a picture here taken on the front lines. This was actually taken the day the Japs were attacking us and I couldn't get out to go get my gun. This is the day after, I mean. This is actually a frontline picture here. This is the mortar squad. And,
well, and Milton will scan them somehow.
Yeah.
And
at least half of these guys got Purple Hearts, or maybe 2/3 of them. See?
Wow. You were a machine gunner.
I was in a light weapons platoon.
Light weapons.
You know,
This
that's a
was
heavy
a 30,
weapon.
30 caliber,
30 caliber. 30.
air cooled.
Yeah.
You carried. One time you mentioned you had
Spare barrels.
the ammo cans and the spare barrels.
Spare
right.
barrels, yeah.
How long did it take you to burn a barrel up?
Oh, you don't burn them up unless you hold that trigger down for maybe 15, 20 seconds at a time. You can get it hot. So you got to concentrate on it just so much, and then let it go.
It's like firing a Thompson, 3 or 4
Yeah,
shots.
you got to be careful how you'd handle it. It's not like the big heavy weapons platoon. They have water jackets, and that barrel is inside of a water jacket.
Right. Went for a B-29 ride.
Oh yeah, I was fortunate. I was getting ready to go to the Philippines with my outfit, and then the doctor said, you got a growth in your eye. They had to operate on it and cut it open. So they put a patch in it. They don't let you make a landing or go nowhere unless your eye is healed. So when I left to go to Okinawa, they just removed the patch. But then all the time I was going down to where the planes were, because there was nobody. When they left, the camp, the tents and everything were empty. There might only been half a dozen of us there if there were medical reasons. So I went down there and horse around because I used to live down in the end of the runway at March Field. And I knew more about airplanes and because grew up around that where the bombers would come in and out. And so I talked to the guys, and in fact, my brother, when he was flying the B-24, on a B-24, they used our barn, my dad's barn, to land as a marker to land at Arch Air Force Base. And my brother used to tell those guys, that's my dad's barn. He says, yeah, we used to use that barn to make our turn to come in there down at March Field. But it just happens to be that I lived there on the end of the runway for all those years, and I watched so many planes fall down.
The 29 ride.
Big plane.
Noisy?
No, quiet.
Was it really?
Yeah, kind of quiet.
How long was this ride, George?
Oh, we weren't out there more than an hour. They
But
were
it was
just breaking in that new motor.
quiet and smooth?
Yeah, you're sitting so far behind them. The pilot is sitting so far in front of it when oh, I know what happened. We were out there a ways, and they put this new engine in, and they put the oil plug in, didn't put it in tight enough. The vibration worked this oil plug out a little bit, and it started to throw a little bit of oil out, and we hit the manifold with smoke. Well, I'm sitting in the blister here, and I'm watching this motor smoke. And so I got a mic on my throat, and I tell her there's only a pilot and a co-pilot, because the co-pilot is a new guy that just came from the States. And he's taking some time in the plane to learn a little bit about it. So I told him, I says, we got an engine, and the sergeant that invited me to go with him is sitting on the other blister. And I said, we got a little smoke coming out of one of the engine. So the sergeant come over to me, and he looked at us and he said, yeah, cut that engine, cut that engine. So they did, but it didn't ruin it because it didn't fall out. The oil was just leaking out. So that was a kind of a scary one, too. But as you go down the runway, these planes are so heavy with bombs that when they drop down off the ocean, it must be several hundred feet down to the water, they drop, pick up a little speed. You know.
Wow. George, been a great interview, really. You're
well, I wish I could have,
sure
had time. I skipped so much because I didn't think
Well, we'd like to do more, but we do have sort of a constraint on our tape, etc. But we've just, I think Milton would attest, we've done a number of these, and the detail and the things that you remember. It's just
well, I didn't see because as soon as the operation was over, I had been offered to go into the kitchen to be a cook because I knew something about cooking. So that's how Tony got me in the kitchen. So the first thing they do is and those old guys, most of the cooks were old guys that the old timers that had fought up in the Aleutian Islands, fought in the Kwajalein, the Philippine Islands, and they come to Okinawa. These guys had 4 campaigns. Some of them had over 120 points. They went by the point system to go home.
how many do you need to come home, George?
At that time, you had over half to 100. I only had about 25, see? So I went from Okinawa. I spent 15 months in Korea.
Wow.
Occupation duty. And that was good duty.
When you got out, what'd you do after you got out, George?
I went with my dad being a partner in a farming.
Oh.
Yeah, we had that land, I tell you. We got 125 acres of land, but I leased other land. But things got so tough, cost was going up. Commodity price of we was growing potatoes, onions, and melons and things like that would go down and stay there. So still, I was paying for water, everything, fuel. So my dad was getting a little old, and I said, my brother was a building contractor, and I used to work for him. That's another story, I could tell you that would come another hour because I worked for the city of Anaheim for 27 years. And I got another story there for 27 years. It looked like it was last. I helped build the Angel Stadium.
You know Gene Autry?
Yeah, I know him.
Do you really? You did know him?
The convention centers. We did all the landscaping. I built all the parks in Anaheim. If you didn't know anybody that knows anything about parks, ask them if they know George Damiano. Because I got my handprints on 38 parks down there. Yeah.
Stop. Let me.
Yeah, I could
let
tell.
me
I'll
eject
talk.
the tape. And then
Well, and I think
keep going.
I think it's important, George, that you get credit for those Purple Hearts. You know, you were that far away from not getting a Purple Heart.
Get killed.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, but
that's right.
now, the instance that fellow, when I sat there and I can and think about it, every time I think about it, I watch those two Japs set that machine gun up, and I'm sitting there, you know, and then they'd shoot that round off. About 3 days later, I went to go into my pocket here, and you know where the Army fatigue jacket is? They got the flap.
Mm-hmm.
I got a bullet hole through one of them. I don't know how it's a bullet hole. Is it a bullet hole, or did a pencil go through it, or what? I don't know, but you know, it makes me think. Maybe one of them did come close to me.
Wow.
And the guy with the hand grenade. Yeah, with a lot of things. I remember we start mopping the island up, and they said, well, you guys got to go down there now and bury the Japs. What the hell? We come up here to kill them, not to bury them. And you take a dead person like that, you know, you're both men and very veterans, and I never talked about this to nobody. But you start pulling one of those Japs around with a rope, you pull bodies parts. You guys put a rope around one of the heads, all they did was pull a head off. See? So they said, well, we better hire these Okinawans to do some work. They can earn some money. So that's what they did.
Wow.
Yeah, it rained so damn much that we couldn't get, we had to walk miles to get our own supplies to eat. You couldn't get to them. They couldn't bring a truck up there. They couldn't bring a weasel. And you know how many, this was the only island that had lost abundant many tanks. There was a place out there that had about 30, 40 acres of tanks that were shot, blew up. See, those Japs, they had the guts, boy, they run up to those tanks and put the charge right on it. They didn't care if they get killed as long as that satchel charge is on that. And they blew the hell out of all our tanks. And then one day, one of the tanks come up and parked next to me. We're sitting in a hole, the kid and I, kind of relaxing, you know. Here comes this big tank, and he's looking down this valley. And he shoots a couple rounds off. You know, and the Japs have got that spot zeroed in. They know every increment spot in the island is from certain guns. So he leaves and says, you SOBs, that's what you came up here for, to pick us out as a target before they can shoot at us the rest of the day. But we were lucky they didn't shoot.
There's a reason they call you the greatest generation, George.
Yeah.
You guys, you know, Milton and I are kind of along for the ride. I was born in 40, and Milton came sometime after, but we certainly appreciate your time today, inviting us into